Before we begin, I need to ask you something. When you picture revival, the real kind, the kind that empties taverns and fills churches, the kind that breaks strongholds over cities and generations, what does the vessel look like? What does the person God chooses look like? Strong, healthy, gifted, educated, a voice that commands a room, a body that can keep up with the calling, a man who has his life together, someone who has been approved by the right institutions, credentialed by the right schools, accepted by the right people. That is the picture most of us carry. We do not say it aloud, but it is there. The assumption that the men and women God uses for the most extraordinary things are, in some sense, extraordinary themselves, that they have what it takes, that the vessel must be strong enough to carry the fire. I want to introduce you to a man who dismantles that assumption entirely, a man who was orphaned before he was 15, a man who was expelled from the only university he ever attended, a man who was coughing blood in the forest while he prayed, not metaphorically, literally, his lungs slowly destroying themselves while he remained on his knees. A man who died at 29 years old, having never pastored a church, never built a ministry, never written a book, never commanded a large crowd. And yet, 3 centuries after his death, John Wesley, William Carey, Jim Elliot, Henry Martyn, Robert Murray McChaney, Andrew Murray, A.W. Tozer, and a line of revival fire that stretches through the centuries to the present day all point back to his story. All say, in one way or another, that something in this man's life changed them, that the record of how he prayed unlocked something in them that nothing else had reached. His name was David Brainerd. And what you are about to hear is not simply a biography. It is a theological statement, an argument made in blood and prayer and forest mud about what God can do with a willing heart. Stay with me. Every minute of this story matters. David Brainerd was born on April 20th, 1718, in Haddam, Connecticut, a small town on the banks of the Connecticut River in the heart of colonial New England. He was the 6th of 9 children born to Hezekiah Brainerd and Dorothy Mason Brainerd. His father was a man of standing in the community, a member of the Connecticut General Assembly, a respected figure in local civic life. The Brainerd home was, by the standards of the era, stable, comfortable, rooted. And then loss arrived. Hezekiah Brainerd died in 1727, when David was 9 years old. The boy who had known the security of a father's presence now knew its absence, but grief in the Brainerd household was not finished. 5 years later, in 1732, Dorothy Brainerd died as well. David was 14 years old. In the space of 5 years, he had buried both parents. He was 14 in colonial America, in a world that had no safety nets and no sentimentality about childhood. You grew up, you worked, you survived, and if God was gracious, perhaps you found something worth living for. What happened inside David Brainerd in the years that followed his mother's death is extraordinarily well documented, because he wrote about it himself in a diary that would become one of the most significant documents in the history of Christian missions. And what he writes about those years is not triumphant. It is honest. It is the record of a young man trying to find solid ground and finding none. He was, by his own account, drawn to religion from an early age, but it was a religion of effort and duty, not of encounter. He fasted. He prayed. He tried to be good enough, holy enough, disciplined enough to earn whatever peace he was looking for, and the peace would not come. He describes, in his diary, a period of months in which the weight of what he called his spiritual inadequacy was almost unbearable. He had inherited the Puritan theological framework of his New England upbringing, a framework that took sin seriously, that understood the holiness of God as something overwhelming and absolute, and that did not offer cheap comfort to those who had not genuinely encountered grace. In that framework, what Brainerd was experiencing was not unusual. It was the normal path of a soul being prepared. But it did not feel normal. It felt like drowning in slow motion. He was 19 when it broke. On a summer evening in 1737, walking alone in a field near his home, something shifted. He later wrote that the sky seemed to open above him, not literally, but in terms of what he suddenly perceived. The love and majesty and nearness of God came upon him with a force he had no categories for. He was not in a church. He was not with a minister. There was no sermon, no altar call, no liturgical moment. There was just a young man in a field, alone with God, and God came. He wrote, "I had a view of the glory of the divine being, which overwhelmed me so that I was filled with anguish and astonishment, and it seemed as though my soul was entirely swallowed up in God." That encounter did not make his life easier. It did not remove the suffering that was coming, but it gave him a reference point, a place he had been, that nothing that followed could entirely erase. In 1739, David Brainerd enrolled at Yale College in New Haven, Connecticut. To understand what this meant, you need to understand what was happening in the American colonies at that precise moment. Because Brainerd did not arrive at Yale in a quiet season. He arrived at the beginning of one of the most dramatic religious upheavals in American history. The Great Awakening was underway. George Whitefield, the English evangelist, whose voice by some accounts could be heard clearly by audiences of 25,000 people, had come to America. Jonathan Edwards had already preached his famous Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God in Enfield, Connecticut in 1741, and the accounts of what happened in that room, people gripping the pews, crying out, falling, being physically overwhelmed by the sense of divine judgment and mercy, were spreading across the colonies like fire through dry grass. For a young man who had already had a profound personal encounter with God, who had stood in a field at 19 and been overwhelmed by divine glory, this was not an abstract theological discussion. This was confirmation. This was the world catching up to something he had already tasted. Brainerd threw himself into the spiritual intensity of the revival season with the full force of his personality. He prayed. He fasted. He sought God with the kind of desperation that the awakening had normalized, and that, frankly, frightened the more settled and cautious members of Yale's faculty. And here is where the tragedy enters. In 1742, in an unguarded moment of youthful zeal, the kind of moment that most of us have had in one form or another, David Brainerd was overheard saying that one of his tutors, a man named Chauncey Whittlesey, had no more grace than this chair. It was a harsh judgment. It was the kind of thing passionate young men say when they are burning with revival fire and they look at institutional Christianity and find it cold. It was, by any measure, an overstatement. But Yale expelled him for it. This requires a moment of historical context. Connecticut had passed a law in 1742, the Act for Regulating Abuses and Correcting Disorders in Ecclesiastical Affairs, which was essentially designed to suppress the more disruptive elements of the Great Awakening. Yale's administration, aligned with the more conservative establishment churches, was operating in that climate. Brainerd's comment was the kind of thing that could be used to make an example, and it was. He appealed. He wrote letters. He sought reinstatement. He acknowledged the error of what he had said. He did everything the institution asked of him in terms of contrition, and Yale refused him. Without a Yale degree, ordination through the Congregational Church, the established ecclesiastical pathway he had been preparing for, was not available to him. The career he had planned The ministry he had imagined was gone. He was 24 years old, and every door he had expected to walk through had been shut. Now, stay with me here, because this is crucial. Because the church has a habit of looking back at moments like this after the story has ended well, and calling them part of God's plan in a way that papers over the genuine cost. The closed door at Yale was not a minor inconvenience for David Brainerd. It was devastating. He wanted to be a minister. He had prepared for it. He had given his grief and his hunger and his years to it, and the institution said no. What he did with that no is the story we are here to tell. In 1742, the same year he was expelled from Yale, David Brainerd made contact with the Society in Scotland for Propagating Christian Knowledge, a missionary organization that was looking for men willing to carry the gospel to the Native American peoples of the northeastern colonies. Let us be honest about what this assignment looked like from the outside. The Native American missions were not considered prestigious work. They were considered the hardest, most thankless, most dangerous assignment available. Missionaries who had gone before Brainerd had largely failed, not because of lack of effort, but because the cultural and spiritual distance between colonial Christianity and the indigenous peoples of North America was almost incomprehensible. The Native Americans had their own cosmologies, their own spiritual frameworks, their own deep suspicion, entirely justified, of the colonists who were simultaneously taking their land and offering them a religion. The track record of the mission was poor. Brainerd accepted the appointment in November 1742. He was licensed to preach, not ordained, because Yale's closed door had blocked that, but licensed, which was enough for the Society's purposes. What followed was 4 years of some of the most physically demanding missionary work in colonial American history. He was assigned first to the Housatonic people near Kaunaumeek, in what is now eastern New York, in April 1743. He lived in a hut. He had one companion, a converted Native American named John Wesley, who served as his interpreter and friend. He had no salary to speak of. He had no congregational support base. He had no home to return to. He had the forest, his Bible, and his diary, and he prayed. The Kaunaumeek period was difficult in ways that go beyond physical hardship. Brainerd found the language barrier almost insurmountable. He found the cultural distance enormous. He found within himself a spiritual darkness that seemed disproportionate to the work. Seasons of what he called deadness in prayer, where the heavens seemed like brass and his intercessions like empty words. And he kept going. After a year at Kaunaumeek, the Society transferred him to the forks of the Delaware River in Pennsylvania, a region with multiple Native American communities, more complex politics, and deeper resistance to the gospel. He arrived in May 1744 and spent the next year making journeys by horseback through terrain that was, by every account, grueling. He was already showing the signs of tuberculosis. He documented fevers, nights of hemorrhaging, days when he could barely sit upright in the saddle. He kept riding. He kept praying. He kept going. The results at the Delaware Forks were discouraging by the numbers. A handful of individuals showed genuine interest in the gospel. But there was no breakthrough, no revival, no sudden opening. The ground was hard. And then, in June 1745, Brainerd made the journey that would change everything. He rode south to Crossweek-Sung, in what is now central New Jersey. If this story is already stirring something in you, take 5 seconds right now to like this video. It costs you nothing, and it tells us you want more stories like this one. Before we come to Crossweek-Sung and the revival that broke out there, I need to tell you about the Rattlesnake. The account comes from multiple sources, including Brainerd's own diary and the testimonies of those who knew him. At some point during his forest journeys, while he was on his way to preach to the Native Americans, alone, as he often was, Brainerd stopped to pray. He went to his knees. He did this regularly. The forest floor was his prayer closet. While he was on his knees, a rattlesnake appeared. The eastern diamondback rattlesnake, one of the most venomous serpents in North America. It came close. By the accounts, it came close enough to strike, and it struck. Nothing happened. The snake could not bite him. Now, I am a historian. I deal in documented facts. And I will tell you honestly that I am cautious about miraculous accounts, about anecdotes that grow in the telling, about the human tendency to mythologize the men we admire. I note all of that. And then I note that this account is corroborated. It was known in the communities Brainerd served. It was known among the Native Americans who heard about it. And it was one of the catalysts, one of several, for the openness that preceded the revival at Crossweek-Sung. Word spread. The man who prays in the forest, the snakes cannot bite him. The God he carries is not a weak God. In a spiritual world that the Native Americans understood very well, a world in which signs and power and the relationship between human beings and the natural order were not abstractions but lived realities. This mattered. This spoke a language they already understood, and hearts began to open. On August 8, 1745, David Brainerd arrived at Crossweek-Sung, New Jersey, and began preaching to a small gathering of Lenape Native Americans. What happened in the following days and weeks is documented in Brainerd's diary in extraordinary detail, and it is one of the most remarkable accounts of spontaneous revival in the entire recorded history of Christian mission. The first meeting was small, perhaps a dozen people. Brainerd preached through his interpreter, a man named Moses Tinda Tautami, who had himself recently come to faith. Tautami was not a professional translator. He was a converted man translating with the fervor of someone who understood from the inside what the words meant. And something broke open. Brainerd wrote in his diary that day, "There was much visible concern among them through the whole of the exercise, and one or two persons seemed to be considerably pierced with the truth, and appeared to weep and cry out." Word spread through the surrounding Native American communities with a speed that no human communication strategy could have engineered. People came from miles away, from communities that Brainerd had not visited, that had no prior relationship with him or with the gospel. They came because something was happening that they could not explain. They came drawn by something they had no name for. Brainerd wrote, days later, "There was an amazing, surprising work of God among them. Numbers were struck down, as it were, with a view of their undone state, and the awful displeasure of God against them for their sins. Some lay prostrate on the ground, others wept with great distress. The power of God seemed to descend upon the whole assembly." He noted something that particularly astonished him, that the power of the meetings did not depend on the quality of his preaching. There were days when he felt his words were flat and lifeless, when he felt he had communicated poorly, when by every internal measure he had failed, and the Spirit moved anyway. There were days when people were overwhelmed before he had finished speaking, or before he had even properly begun. He understood what this meant. The moving was not in the words. The moving was in the atmosphere, an atmosphere that had been built hour after hour, day after day, season after season, by a man on his knees in the forest. The revival at Crossweek-Sung continued for months. By the end of 1745, Brainerd had a congregation of Native American believers who were, by every account, genuinely transformed, not superficially, Not temporarily. They stopped drinking. Marriages were restored. Practices that had held the community in bondage for generations were abandoned. A community that had been fragmented by the trauma of colonial displacement found in this gospel something that actually held them together. In 1746, Brainerd moved the community to Cranberry, New Jersey, a more settled location where he could establish something approaching a permanent Christian community. He built a school. He taught the children to read. He organized the community along lines that respected their own culture, while introducing them to a faith that he genuinely believed was for them. Not a colonial imposition, but a universal inheritance. At the peak of this work, Brainerd had approximately 130 Native American believers gathered at Cranberry, people who had been baptized, who gathered regularly for worship, who could pray and read the scripture, who were living evidence of what happens when a man refuses to quit. 130 souls in a man's entire life's work, in a world that measures ministry by megachurches and millions. Remember that number, because the story does not end with 130. We need to pause the chronology here, because if we simply tell the story of what happened at Crossweek Sung without examining what produced it, we have missed the entire point. David Brainerd's prayer life is the story. Everything else is the fruit. I have spent more than 50 years studying the lives of men and women who have carried revival fire. I have read the biographies, the diaries, the letters, the eyewitness accounts, and I can tell you with the confidence of long study, there is no account of genuine, sustained, transformative revival in the history of the Church that does not have, at its root, a man or woman who prayed in ways that the comfortable church would call extreme. Brainerd was not the most gifted preacher of his era. Edwards was more theologically formidable. Whitefield was more naturally magnetic. Brainerd himself acknowledged repeatedly that he felt his communication was inadequate, that he struggled to find the right words, that language barriers compounded his own limitations. But no one in the colonial American church prayed like David Brainerd. His diary, which Jonathan Edwards later edited and published, gives us a window into a prayer life of almost frightening intensity. He records days that began before dawn and continued until after dark, with the entire interval given to intercession. He prayed in the forest because the forest was where he could be alone, where there were no social obligations pulling him back, where the only audience was God. He records the sweat. He records the tears. He records the moments when prayer felt like wrestling, when he came before God, not with polished petitions, but with the kind of raw, desperate, clinging intercession that Jacob modeled at the ford of Jabbok. He records the days when prayer produced nothing he could feel, when the heavens seemed entirely closed, when his words seemed to go nowhere, when he felt, as he put it, utterly helpless and dead. And then he records what came next, because what consistently came next in Brainerd's diary is what he called the opening, moments where the closed heavens suddenly parted and something moved through him and around him that had no human explanation, moments of what he called sweet communion, of divine presence so palpable that it left him on his face on the ground, weeping not with sorrow, but with something he could barely describe. He wrote at one point, "I seemed to be in a new world. I was weary of going on my knees, but not weary of the prayer. My whole soul was in agony for the poor heathens around me. I felt I would rather die in prayer for them than live without it." Read that sentence again. I would rather die in prayer for them than live without it. This was not poetry. This was a statement of literal preference from a man who was, at the time, already dying. Because here is the extraordinary, almost unbearable thing about David Brainerd's prayer life. He prayed with tuberculosis, not in spite of tuberculosis, not around it, with it. He was coughing blood while he prayed. He was running fevers of 102 degrees while he prayed. He was riding miles on horseback through winter cold, arriving somewhere, lying down for hours because his body had simply stopped functioning, and then getting up and praying. The modern church has developed a sophisticated theology of rest, of self-care, of margin and balance, and sustainable ministry. Some of that theology is genuinely wise. The human body is not infinite. Burnout is real. Limits matter. But I want you to sit with David Brainerd's example for a moment and let it do what it is designed to do, which is to make you uncomfortable with the excuses you have accepted about your own prayer life, not to condemn you, not to establish a standard of suffering for its own sake, but to ask you, if a man dying of tuberculosis found that prayer was worth continuing, what is your reason for not praying? What is the thing that has convinced you that your circumstances make sustained intercession impossible? Brainerd's example does not answer that question for you, but it refuses to let you answer it cheaply. Share this documentary right now with someone in your network who needs to hear this story. And if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel. We release these stories to keep the fire alive. We need to speak plainly about David Brainerd's tuberculosis. Not because suffering is romantic, it is not, but because the refusal to quit in the face of it is one of the most important things about him. Tuberculosis in the 18th century was called consumption. The name was accurate. It consumed the body slowly, systematically, from the inside. It was caused by Mycobacterium tuberculosis, though no one in 1745 knew this, and it attacked primarily the lungs, though in advanced cases it spread to other organs. Its symptoms included relentless coughing, the coughing of blood, night sweats, extreme fatigue, significant weight loss, and periodic fevers that could become delirium. Brainerd likely contracted the disease in his early 20s. By the time he was at the Delaware Forks in 1744, he was 26. The symptoms were already pronounced enough that he was documenting them in detail in his diary. He writes of days when he raised much blood, the clinical term for what we would call hemoptysis, coughing up blood from the lung tissue. He writes of nights so consumed by fever that he could barely rise in the morning. And he rode the next day, and he prayed. His contemporaries noticed. John Sargent, a fellow missionary, wrote with concern about Brainerd's physical state. The men who knew him expressed repeatedly their amazement that he was still functioning at the level he was functioning at, that his body had not simply stopped. One observer wrote that Brainerd appeared to be operating on something other than physical reserves. That is not hagiography. That is a documented observation made by people who knew him in person, who could see what his body looked like, and who could not account for the output. By 1747, the disease had progressed beyond what could be managed in the field. It was John Sargent's widow who first arranged for Brainerd to receive better care, and it was eventually Jonathan Edwards who opened his home in Northampton, Massachusetts. Brainerd arrived in May 1747. He was 29 years old. He weighed, by most accounts, very little. He was, in any clinical assessment, dying, and in the Edwards household, in the months that followed, he kept praying. He kept writing in his diary. He kept interceding for the Native American community at Cranberry, for the broader mission, for the church. He died on October 9th, 1747. He was 29 years, 5 months, and 19 days old. What happened in Jonathan Edwards' house in the summer and autumn of 1747 deserves its own treatment, because the story of how David Brainerd's fire was transmitted to subsequent generations begins here, in this house, with this man watching. Jonathan Edwards was, by 1747, one of the most intellectually formidable figures in the history of American Christianity. His theological output was extraordinary. His sermons had been catalysts for the Great Awakening. His mind was, by any standard, remarkable, and he was undone by watching David Brainerd die. Edwards wrote later that what he observed in those months, what he saw in the quality of Brainerd's prayer, in the consistency of his devotion, in the lack of self-pity or complaint or spiritual retreat in the face of physical collapse, was unlike anything he had encountered in a living person. Edwards had read about saints. He had studied their lives. He had himself known genuine spiritual experiences, but to be in a room with David Brainerd, to eat meals in his presence, to walk in the garden with him, to hear him pray when he thought no one was listening, was a different order of encounter. Edwards's daughter, Jerusha, fell in love with Brainerd during these months. She nursed him. She sat with him through the long nights of fever. By most accounts, the two were deeply attached, and Edwards, watching his daughter care for this dying young man, had to have been moved at a level that went beyond the theological. Jerusha Edwards died just 4 months after Brainerd, at 17 years old, of the same disease. She had, most historians believe, contracted tuberculosis from nursing him. She was buried, at her own request, beside him. Jonathan Edwards, having lost both his daughter and his young friend within the span of months, took the diary of David Brainerd and prepared it for publication. He edited it carefully. He wrote a preface that by itself is one of the most powerful commendations of a human life ever put to paper. He did not inflate the story or romanticize it. He told it straight. He said, in essence, "Here is a man who showed me what it means to live entirely for God." Read this. Follow it. The diary was published in 1749, 2 years after Brainerd's death, under the title, "An Account of the Life of the Late Reverend Mr. David Brainerd." What happened next was extraordinary. What happened next is why we are here today. John Wesley read the diary of David Brainerd. Wesley, the founder of Methodism, the man whose open-air preaching across England triggered a revival so transformative that many historians credit it with preventing England from undergoing the kind of violent revolutionary upheaval that France experienced in 1789. Wesley read this diary, and he said something that has echoed through centuries of missionary and revival history. He said, "Let every preacher read carefully over the life of David Brainerd," and more famously, he declared that any man who wished to bring revival in his generation needed 2 things, a Bible and the life and diary of David Brainerd. Not a degree, not a platform, not an institution behind him, a Bible, and this one man's journal. Wesley was not a man who gave such endorsements easily. He was intellectually rigorous and pastorally demanding. When John Wesley told the Methodist movement to read something, they read it. William Carey read the diary of David Brainerd. Carey, the cobbler from Northamptonshire who, in 1793, sailed for India and effectively launched the modern Protestant missionary movement, had Brainerd's diary as one of the foundational texts of his calling. He read it as a young man. He read it again and again. He carried the image of Brainerd praying in the forest with him to Serampore, to the rice paddies, to the decades of translation work that produced the Bible in Bengali, Sanskrit, and dozens of other languages. The modern missionary movement, everything that followed Carey, the hundreds of missionary societies, the tens of millions of people who have come to faith through the missionary era, traces part of its genealogy back through Carey's diary to Brainerd's diary. Henry Martyn read the diary of David Brainerd. Martyn was the Cambridge scholar, a man of extraordinary intellectual gifts, one of the most naturally brilliant young minds of his generation, who walked away from a career of comfort and academic distinction to carry the gospel to Persia and India, and who died in 1812 at the age of 31, having translated the New Testament into Hindustani, Persian, and Arabic. When asked what moved him to abandon everything, Martyn pointed to Brainerd. Robert Murray McCheyne read the diary of David Brainerd. McCheyne, the Scottish minister who, before his death at 29 years old in 1843, had triggered a revival across Dundee and the Scottish lowlands that transformed thousands of lives, carried Brainerd as a companion text throughout his ministry. When McCheyne died at exactly the same age as Brainerd, his contemporaries noted the parallel with a kind of holy solemnity. Jim Elliot read the diary of David Brainerd. Elliot, the young American missionary who, in January 1956, was speared to death on a riverbank in Ecuador, along with 4 companions, while attempting to make first contact with the Huaorani people, had written in his famous journal the words, "He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose." Elliot's journals reveal a man who had absorbed Brainerd deeply, who had wrestled with the same questions of cost and calling, who had arrived at the same conclusion, that a life given entirely to God is the only life worth living, regardless of how long it lasts. A. W. Tozer, Andrew Murray, David Livingstone. The list continues. Across 3 centuries, in traditions as different as Methodist revival, Baptist mission, Reformed theology, and Pentecostal renewal, the same thread keeps appearing. The same diary, the same young man praying on his knees in the New Jersey forest. This is not coincidence. This is not sentimentality. This is the testimony of history. The fire that David Brainerd carried did not go out when his body gave out. It transferred. It found new vessels. It crossed oceans and centuries and denominational walls, and it kept burning. Like this video, if the story of David Brainerd has moved you today, share it, because someone you know needs to hear this. Subscribe so you don't miss our next episode. And stay with us. We have 2 more crucial things to say before we close. I want to speak directly to someone who is watching this. You have been rejected. Not from Yale. That specific scenario is unlikely to repeat itself. But you have been rejected from something you were certain God was calling you to. A church that said no. A denomination that closed its doors to you. A ministry position that went to someone else. A leadership that assessed you and found you wanting. An institution that expelled you, literally or functionally, from the path you had been preparing to walk. And you have heard people tell you that rejection is redirection, and you have wanted to believe it. But it has been hard, because the thing you wanted mattered, because you had given years to preparing for it, because the closed door was not a small inconvenience, but a genuine loss. I am not going to minimize that. The expulsion from Yale was a genuine loss for David Brainerd. He mourned it. He sought reversal. He tried every legitimate avenue available to him. It took time, real time, with real anguish, for him to find the alternative path. But here is what history records. The Native Americans of New Jersey did not need David Brainerd to be ordained by the Congregational Establishment of Connecticut. They needed someone who would go. They needed someone who would pray. They needed someone who had been stripped of the institutional props that give most ministers their confidence, and who had discovered, on the far side of that stripping, that God was enough. The institution that rejected Brainerd was not wrong about everything. He had said something unwise. He bore some responsibility for the outcome. But the institution was wrong about one thing. It assessed him by its own categories, and its categories were too small for what God had planned to do with him. The door that closes is not always a verdict. Sometimes it is a direction. The mission field that was not on Brainerd's original plan, the forest, the Native Americans, the praying in the cold, turned out to be the field where his particular combination of gifts and wounds and hunger and willingness was exactly what was needed. Yours may be the same. The field you were redirected to may be the field you were always meant for. You may not see that yet. But the story of David Brainerd is evidence that God does not require the institution's approval to accomplish his purposes through a willing person. I want to say something now that may not fit neatly into the categories we usually use when we talk about revival. It requires a certain theological patience. Stay with me. We understand revival in certain ways. We understand it as a sovereign movement of the Spirit, a season in which God comes with unusual power, in which conviction falls on communities, in which what is normally difficult becomes suddenly, overwhelmingly possible. Souls saved in unusual numbers, lives turned around, communities transformed. We understand revival as something that happens in a season, and then, to some degree, subsides. The Welsh revival of 1904, the Azusa Street outpouring of 1906, the Hebrides revival of 1949. These were seasons, extraordinary seasons, but seasons. Brainerd's revival at Crossweek Sung was also a season. The 130 souls at Cranberry, the transformed community, the signs and wonders. That season ended when his body gave out, when he could no longer ride, no longer preach, no longer gather the community. But there is a dimension of revival that we rarely name, and it is the dimension that Brainerd's story illuminates most clearly. Call it the revival of alignment. There are men and women in the history of the Church whose lives do not merely produce revival in their own generation. Their lives become a template, a pattern, a transmission point through which the fire is carried forward. Their diaries are not merely memoirs. They are, to those who read them with genuine openness, an encounter with the same Spirit who moved through the original life. The record of how they walked with God becomes, in the hands of the Spirit, a pathway for others to walk the same way. When William Carey read Brainerd's diary, something was aligned in him. Something that had been potential became actual. The willingness that was already there found the pattern it needed, the model of what it looks like to give everything, to pray without stopping, to go to the hardest field and stay. When Jim Elliot read the diary, something was aligned in him. When McChaney read it, when Wesley read it, when Andrew Murray read it. Revival was not just happening at Crossweek Sung in 1745. Revival was happening in Northamptonshire when Carey read those pages. Revival was happening in a Dundee manse when McChaney wept over them. Revival was happening in Ecuador in a young man's journal when Elliot's calling crystallized into certainty. The revival that Brainerd carried did not die with Brainerd. It was deposited into ink and paper, into a diary, into the hands of Jonathan Edwards, and from there it was transmitted, generation after generation, to every person who encountered it with a willing heart. That is what we mean when we say revival leaves relics. Not dead relics, museum pieces, historical curiosities, living relics, documents, stories, accounts that carry something of the original fire in their telling. that can be picked up by a man or woman in any generation, in any culture, in any circumstance, and set them on fire all over again. David Brainerd is not finished. He is still working. He is working right now, in whatever this story is doing in you as you hear it. David Brainerd was 29 years old when he died. He had no church building. He had no denomination. He had no degree. He had no salary, no platform, no published work in his own name. What he had was a diary filled with prayers, a community of 130 Native American believers who knew the name of Jesus because he had come to them, and an example, documented in extraordinary detail, of what it looks like when a human being decides that prayer is not optional, that the mission field is not someone else's responsibility, and that no door that closes can close the door that God Himself opens. He left you 4 things. He left you the evidence that physical weakness is not a disqualification for spiritual power, that the vessel's frailty does not limit the capacity of what it carries, that God is not looking for strength, He is looking for availability. He left you the evidence that institutional rejection is not the same as divine rejection, that the people who say no to you do not hold the final word over your calling, that the door that matters is the one God opens, not the ones that men close. He left you the evidence that prayer is the thing, not strategy, not giftedness, not eloquence, not platform. A man on his knees in a forest changed an entire community, and that community's story changed the trajectory of the modern missionary movement. And that movement has carried the gospel to hundreds of millions of people. It started on the forest floor. It started in intercession. And he left you this, the understanding that your life can be a transmission point, that if you will walk with God the way Brainerd walked, at cost, in obscurity, with willingness, the fire that comes through your life will not stop when your life stops. It will find new vessels. It will cross generations. It will do things in other hands that you will never see and cannot imagine. Brainerd never saw Wesley. He never saw Carey. He never saw Jim Elliot standing on a riverbank in Ecuador, making the same choice he made in a New Jersey forest 2 centuries earlier. He never saw any of it. He just prayed, and went, and prayed some more. And the fire is still burning.